one of the weeks we were doing TBS NASCAR. Ken Squire at the time, everybody knew that he couldn't see the cars really well. He was notorious for misidentifying the cars. He was also notorious for leaving his microphone on and going to the restroom.
Oh, no.
In the mix, in my ear, I'm hearing Ken relieve himself. Hi, everybody. I'm Rick Benjamin. You're watching the Derek Pernesiglio Show.
Get out, drive you!
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Derek Pernesiglio Show. And this week's guest is a very special guest to me. If it wasn't for him, I never would have gotten my start on air as talent. He has been the host of the Champ Car World Series. He was the host of Race Day on TNN when it was around. He's probably worked on every single network that was around and some that aren't around anymore. Rick Benjamin. Rick, you look great, man. Thanks for coming on.
Derek, thanks for the invite. Good to see you again, as always. Yeah, we spent a lot of fun years together, and hopefully many more to come. So yeah.
Yeah, I can't remember when it was the last time that we saw each other. Besides this, I think it was at Gateway. I think
Yeah.
It was during IndyCar. You and Kyle were there.
Yeah.
And I was doing the ARCA race, well, K&N, now ARCA.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's where we saw each other quick. So how you been? What have you been up to since then?
We've been fine. We've been great. We've been very blessed, very fortunate. The COVID knocked the legs out from under a lot of us who do this or have done this, and
Big time.
We were extremely busy up through the early part of 2020, and then all of a sudden everything stopped. We were getting ready, myself and our crew, my son Kyle, as you mentioned, and the 4 or 5 of our other Carolinas production group guys. We're going to go to the St. Petersburg Grand Prix. We had corporate work with Honda for many years. American Honda and Acura were our primary client for the last 7 or 8 years. And we were going down there to cover the IndyCar race. We did a monthly show for them on television. We did social media content for them every day, every week. And I got a call saying, don't come. You can't get in. And they were going to run the race at that point. It was like March 15th, somewhere around that time frame of 2020. And we were going to go from there to Sebring, which was normally the schedule up until recently, where those 2 races ran back-to-back in Florida. And we didn't go. And before another couple of days had lapsed, the IndyCar had postponed the race. They said we're going to run it later, and they did run it later that year with no fans. And that was pretty much it for us in producing event coverage and going to the racetrack every week. We were going to the racetrack 40 weeks a year for a long, long time up till then. And since then, it's not been easy for anybody in the sport. I mean, or anybody who does television or radio work or media work in this sport. But we've survived and soldiered on. And this year we've got a couple of good projects in the works. And I don't work on the air as much as I'd like to. When you called and said, "Hey, let's do this," I thought, "Cool, let's go have some fun, tell some stories, and talk a bit." But I'm at an age and stage of life where slowing down is not a bad thing. I turned 70 last year, so
Congratulations.
Yeah,
All
thanks.
right.
So I don't want to retire, and I'm not going to. But being on the road all the weeks that you are, if you do this full time, as you know, and as I've been privileged to be able to do it for such a long time, it wears on you after a while, and you think, maybe half that would be good. So we'll see what happens. I'm going to Indy next week, which is great for the 500.
Awesome.
So,
to enjoy or work?
To work.
Okay, good. What are you doing?
Well, we have a media services client that we've had for several years, Able Motorsports, Road to Indy team based in Louisville, Kentucky, with a shop now in Speedway, Indiana, right outside the gates of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And Bill Able, the principal there, he's the owner of the construction company. His son, Jacob, has been a Road to Indy driver for several years, riding Indy Next, as it's now called, Indy Lights, as many remember it. And they'd wanted to advance him to IndyCar. Well, he's not quite ready yet. He's 22. But they had an opportunity this year to enter the 500. A driver named R.C. Enerson out of Florida, who was a Road to Indy stalwart for many years, won a bunch of lights races, and I think was second or third in the championship a couple of times. He's been knocking on the IndyCar door for 5 or 6 years now. They tried to qualify in 21. He and his dad, Neil, own a car, and they have teamed up with the Ables. Able Motorsports is going to run the car, enter the car. It'll be a Chevy team, and I'm going to be on site to handle their media needs. So
That's cool.
Yeah.
How many Indy 500s have you been to?
Oh my gosh, I've lost track. The first one I went to was 1970. I just graduated from high school, and my dad, as kind of my high school graduation gift, although I had to pay my own way, but he agreed to go to the 500 with me. And back then, Chris Economaki at National Speed Sport News, they ran a charter out of New York, out of LaGuardia every year. You could buy a ticket that would get you the flight out early in the morning. We left at like 5:30 in the morning from LaGuardia, flew to Indy. They'd bust you to the speedway. It included a race ticket. We sat on the fourth turn, watched the race. You got a box lunch, and then you got bussed back to the airport after the checkered flag, and we flew home that night. And it was cool. It was like $400 back in the day to do that. So I convinced my dad that we should go together to the 500, and we did. And that was the first one as a fan. And I bet I've been to 25 over the years since then. So, yeah. So it'll be nice. First time since 19 that I'll actually be working there. But, it's just when I think back all the places that I've been, and you've been a lot of these same places, of course, you think about these legendary facilities you've been to, and you think, man, I'm one of the coolest experiences I had at Indy when we were working for Honda these last many years. Honda had been the sponsor of what they call the fastest ride in sports. It's a 2-seater IndyCar that for a long time had Honda power. Well, Mario Andretti drove that car, not all the time, but in many races he would drive. And this was 2017, 2018, in the run-up to the Grand Prix, which is this weekend at the Speedway. Honda came to me and he said, we'd really love you to do a story for our content package that we had for them on this fastest ride in sports. So I went to Jeff Sinden, SRS Motorsports in Indy. They were an IRL team back in the day, but I've known Jeff for 25, 30 years. And they operate that for IndyCar. They operate those 2-seaters for IndyCar. And I went to Jeff and I told him what they wanted to do. And he said, no problem. Get a suit, get a helmet. I'll get you in line, get you a ride. So I'm thinking, okay, I got our camera guys. We put an onboard camera on the car. I'm thinking about all these different things. And as I walk up to the car, Mario is going to drive me around the road course.
Oh, God, what a treat.
And I've, again, known Mario since the race day days. So, again, it's been 25 years or so since I had met him face-to-face and interviewed him. And since then, I've had many other opportunities to do that. He looks at me and he says, am I taking you for a ride? I said, man, this is a dream of a lifetime. I mean, the only thing to me that would have been better than that would have AJ Foyt do it. And, of course, AJ hasn't driven an IndyCar in a long time. But Mario's still fit. I mean, he still works out. He looks the same as he did when he drove.
He's the most famous race car driver in the world. You don't have to like racing and know the name Mario Andretti. Yeah.
Exactly so. So we get in the thing, and he's not holding back. I mean, he likes to punch the throttle. So
you think he wanted
we're hauling the mail down the front. You only get 2 laps in one of these rides. So we leave pit road, and he goes down into one, and he's like, I'm having the full experience back. It was unbelievable. I don't think the grin left my face for a month. It was fantastic. And that piece of video still lives. So that's pretty cool. So
he was probably trying to scare the hell out of you, too.
Oh, sure. No, sure. I haven't had those opportunities over the years. One of my favorite stories about that kind of thing back in the race day days, this was in the late 90s. NASCAR coverage back then was a lot different than it is today. There were, we had races on TNN. ESPN had some races. And then TBS, who I also worked for at the time, had a package of 6 races back in those days.
I remember. That's the stuff that I grew up on.
Yeah.
Where I was watching you as a kid.
Yeah.
So to
now
eventually,
you've got more gray hair than I do.
I know,
almost as much. So they're making me feel old. Back then, the teams had bigger sponsors, generally speaking. It wasn't the way it is now, where a cup team might have 6 or 8 different partners, as they call them, during the season, and the car changes livery all the time and all that. Back then, the Valvoline car was the Valvoline car. Mark Martin drove the 6, and it was the same every week, red, white, and blue. So I can't remember exactly what the purpose was, but it was probably promoting the 600 or promoting the fall 500-mile race at the Speedway up here in Charlotte. And they would do media days. And back then, there were a lot of media that covered the sport on a full-time basis. There were, daily newspapers were still a thing.
All over.
There was probably a regular weekly NASCAR media contingent of 40, 50, 60 people that went to every race.
You're right. Remember, there was Area Auto, Gator.
Yeah.
There was
the
Winston
Speed
Cup
Sport,
scene,
Winston Cup scene.
Insta, everything.
Yeah.
Everything.
Plus the daily papers. Every newspaper in North and South Carolina had somebody at the racetrack all the time.
Right.
USA Today staffed all the races. Of course, the Associated Press. Anyway, the point of it is that they would have a media event. Every week there'd be a couple of media events for people who covered the sport. This particular day, it was to go to the Speedway and hear Humpy or somebody talk about what was going to come up at the racetrack in the next race. And part of the deal was you got to ride with a Roush driver. So it was Ted Musgrave at the time. I think Johnny Benson was one of the guys. Mark. Might have been Jeff Burton. There were 4 or 5 of them driving, and I got to ride with Mark, and I knew Mark pretty well, and they had 2-seater versions of all those cars back then, So I get up, I put my helmet on. I get in the car. Marco didn't say a word to me. He looks over at me and kind of gives me this grin, like,
yeah.
And I'm telling you, I know he was trying to scare me. I mean, we went 2 laps around Charlotte. It seemed like wide open. He barely cracked the throttle on this thing. And the car was not in race trim, but still. And he had us right at the wall the whole time, the outside wall. So that my hand, if I had my right arm resting on the roll cage bar, it's 6 inches from the concrete. And I'm thinking...
And that's before safer barriers.
Oh, well, yeah, way before safer barriers. I'm thinking, if something happens here, we're going to hit a ton. And then I thought, no, wait a minute. Richard Petty always told me he used the high line because if he wrecked, he didn't have as far to go to hit something.
Right.
And Harry Gant did the same thing.
Right.
So I thought, well, if we hit, it won't be that bad. We'll slide around the wall. Of course, we didn't. We completed the ride safely. But I'll never forget Mark looking at me and getting out of the car later and him saying, "Did you have fun?" I said, "Yeah, I had a great time." He said, "I tried to scare you." I said, "Yeah, no kidding."
That's awesome.
So those kinds of experiences you can't put a price tag on.
Just the amazing stories that you've got over the years, and just being around for that long. I mean, God, you started off in local news, right?
Yeah, I started in radio actually when I was in college. It's been a couple of years now, but would have been 2022. I marked my 50th year of getting a paycheck in this business of broadcasting. So,
wow, good for you. That's the other thing I was going to ask you, too, was longevity in this business. Nowadays, it is harder and harder to make a living in this sport, doing what we do. Everything is so downsized. What do you do to keep that longevity and keep going in the sport?
Well, today, and I get asked this question fairly regularly now, but young people come to me and say, I really love what you've done. I watched you for years. How do I get started? My advice is don't, because you can't do this and make a living at it anymore. I mean, the number of people that, if you don't work for NBC, it's not even NBC Sports Network anymore. That's gone. So, in that discussion that I started down a few minutes ago about how these networks don't exist anymore, if you don't work for ESPN or NBC Universal, which means you're going to be on Peacock all the time, their streaming service, you can't do this. MAV TV is, at the moment, the only other motorsports network that exists, and they've gone through huge changes in the last 6 months, as I'm sure you know.
Yep.
They haven't ever grown. They're 22 million homes. They're actually smaller than they used to be. MAV TV, owned by Lucas Oil, and they've pulled back their ownership investment quite heavily. So basically, they're not hiring people to work on the air anymore as a general rule. They have a few people, but nothing like they were a few years ago.
Right.
The Bob Dillner go, they shut down their production, they did a lot of different things. So if you, as a young person, want to get into this, and I started as a track announcer, and you probably did the same thing.
I did.
I worked at a couple of tracks and made a couple $100 a night. Well, amazingly, I mean, the last track job I had at a short track was in the early 80s at Franklin County Speedway up the road in Callaway, Virginia, not far from here.
Still in operation
Still
today.
in operation.
Yep.
I did a race there last year. And a guy named Whitey Taylor still owns the property. He doesn't manage the track anymore, but he still owns the land. I saw Whitey. It was great. I hadn't seen him in 40 years. And they're still paying at that level $150, $200 a night to announce. That's what I made 40 years ago doing that.
Right.
And that was side money. I was a news anchor in the market at that time. I'd get down there on Saturday night and call a race. That's how I got started on Motor Racing Network back in 1981. Was working in Roanoke on TV and then working at Franklin County. So the point of all this is, I guess, that it is harder than ever today to make a living on the media side of this sport. And there are people who do it, who cobble it together. But when I started, you could make a good living doing this, and a lot of guys did for a long time. I say a lot of guys.
Living.
There were maybe 25 or 30 of us who did this full time, really, in the country. But still, you could do it, and there were people who could put a show together. They could sell that show, sell advertising in that show. They could get it on TV somewhere, and they could make a good living doing that. The company we started that you worked for, Carolina's Production Group, we still have it. But our business for a long time, starting in 2006, I mean, we went 14 years where we produced event coverage for networks. And that was great. I mean, certainly we did very well with it for a long time.
It's what gave me my start.
Yeah, that business doesn't exist anymore.
I know.
So, it's the company. I kept the company alive because we're doing some video work here and there. But the days of us doing the Honda work for 40 weeks, doing Trans Am, doing F3 and F4, doing, when you and I were working on the Mazda project before that. That was before we got Honda. We did Trans Am, we did ARCA, we did Robbie Gordon Stadium Super Trucks, we did the F3 and F4. We were busy year round, and I was employing 40 or 50 people a year to do all those shows.
Right.
Now that's all gone.
With, like you said, things have stayed the same, in racing in some areas, but what was it that you think that has changed? Is it been the multiple platforms? Is it just the technology? Well, what do you think it is?
Some of all of that. I mean, when you think about it, think about how we consume media today. Up until, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, let's say, streaming was around, but it wasn't the dominant factor in what people thought of when they think of television. Well, now, cord cutting is a real thing. I mean, it's a big deal. The number of homes with cable or satellite television is half of what it used to be.
I stream.
Yeah, we do too. Mm-hmm. So, you take that element out of it, and that has made the cable network business basically almost worthless in many areas. So that's why you've had, Speed Vision became Fox Sports 1. Well, they're still limping along, Fox Sports 1, Fox Sports 2. But Speed Vision as an entity is coming back as what's called a fast channel now, free ad-supported television. What's old becomes new again. Speed Sport, that you had an involvement with, I know, for a long time, trying to do the same thing. They didn't launch when they were supposed to on April 15th, and no one knows if or when they will. Racing is, as much as we all love it, it's a small sport.
Yeah. I
mean, NASCAR gets a lot of attention, and rightly so. Formula One is on the rise in this country, which to me is just astonishing, but it is. IndyCar is IndyCar and has grown, again, back to where it's healthy, and Roger Penske knows what he's doing and has gotten them to a good place, I think, in a lot of areas. But the days of, when I started doing this full-time in 1995, 1996, a long time ago now, everyone thought NASCAR was the next NFL. I remember Bill France Jr. saying, we're going to be like the NFL. We're going to televise every race. We're going to be on one network. We're going to get a huge amount of money. Well, the numbers were a lot smaller back then. NASCAR does get a lot of TV money now. That's what keeps the sport afloat. And as long as live sports are the driver for Fox and NBC and the other networks and the big streaming platforms are starting to get into it now with the NFL, the money will keep flowing. But what you've seen is that everything lower than that tier of NASCAR, IndyCar, and F1, everything else is struggling. And they're trying to, the short tracks that you and I grew up on and love dearly are trying to get by with some streaming money. Mm-hmm. And it's small money. I mean, it's, you're in a situation where, I won't name the series, but we did some work last year for Flow Sports. The budgets are tiny. I mean, tiny.
Oh, yeah.
They're paying a company like ours to go do a race at Franklin County, which is one of the ones we did last year, less money than I used to get as an announcer to go and televise that race. So that's one indicator of how much it's changed.
Mm-hmm. It's a shame, though, because the racing is so good because it has been more competitive than it has been in years. There's more ways to find it and see it. Like, it's just there are some positives out of it. Sure. I mean, what we can do to try to get that back up to what it used to be. Streaming is here to stay. COVID brought streaming in.
It did.
Without a doubt. I mean, it is here to stay no matter what.
Well, and you think about it, again, these conversations I've had with many, many people in the sport and in the industry over the last couple of years, the industry of broadcasting. When you think about it, if you're a short track promoter or a series operator, we talked about Must See Racing, we televised that series for several years, where in past days, not that long ago, they would have had to pay a company like ours, say, $20,000 a show to come produce the race, edit it down to an hour, put it on television. That was, that'd be all in, music, graphics, talent, the whole thing. Well, now they can get maybe a $20,000 check for their season. Rather than spending $200,000 to do 10 races, they can get maybe $20,000 from a streaming entity and have the streaming entity, quote unquote, produce the race. Well, what they're doing is they're taking the track PA announcer, who's probably not very good, and they're taking one or two cameras, maybe, and they're following the leaders around the racetrack. Now, that's not a television show, but it's video of the race. So if you're an ardent fan of that kind of racing, you may say, well, that's okay. I paid my $19.99 a month, whatever it is. I'm good with that. I can watch. You've got all these great signs up here of these places, some of which are still around and some aren't. But if you're a Flow Sports subscriber, for example, you can sit there on a Saturday night and you can choose from, I could watch Orange County. I still have my subscription. River, yeah. I mean, there's 75 tracks you could watch, maybe more than that on a Saturday night. And you say, man, okay, they're rained out at, they're rained out at Middletown. I'm going to go watch Lebanon Valley, or whatever it happens to be. So there's that advantage to it. But where I think this is not going to be able to be continued for a long time, you've got several different players. Speed Sport does some of this. Flow is the big dog. Dirt does their own thing with the World of Outlaws. And they do some other events besides the Outlaw late models and the sprint cars. And if you're a consumer, if you're somebody, and not you or me, but if you're Joe fan or Jane fan sitting at home and you're thinking, okay, I got to spend $200 a year for my subscription to Dirt Vision. I got to spend $150 a year for my subscription to Flow. I've got to spend, I don't know what the number is. Let's say it's $150 a year for Speed Sport.
Right.
Well, I'm now close to $600 on this. That's not a small amount of money to most people.
Right, and I've kind of said this before, where adding it all up, you get to a big number eventually. At what point do we reach where somebody comes along and bundles all of these streaming services and basically reinvents cable?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think that's the holy grail in this, whether you're talking about racing on a small scale or the much bigger scale. I mean, for the way we watch television in our house, it still makes sense. We happen to do business with Spectrum, which is the local cable company, although we stream their channel package now, because for us, we get our internet from them, we get our cell phones from them, and we get TV from them. So it's a little bit better deal to do it that way for us. But it depends on where you live and what your competition is and all those kind of things. It's going to change. It has to. I mean, it's changing every day. I still get a ton of industry emails, both motorsports and broadcasting, every day in my inbox. I try to keep up with what's going on. And if you track it over a period of a week or a month or 6 months, the whole thing changes constantly. So where we're going to be a year from now, I have no idea. What's going to happen in racing, I think, is at some point the streamers will look at it, and they'll have to, whether it's Flow or Speed Sport or whoever it is, and say, wait a minute, we're spending X dollars to produce all this coverage at all these races. 90% of it's stuff that nobody watches or 500 people watch or whatever. We're going to have to cut back on this because they're already doing it as cheaply as you could possibly do it. I mean, they're doing coverage, I won't call it television, in a way that I don't find watchable as a general rule. Some tracks take it more seriously and do a better job. Some series take it seriously and do a better job. For the most part,
the multiple camera tracks, I think, do incredibly well. Places like Stafford or where they're going to like when they do the Snowball Derby, they'll have aerial coverage.
Yeah, I forgot about Racing America. Yeah,
they do that too. Yeah. But I know what you mean by it's not the same as television. You know, it's a video production. It's not the same as television. The rates are less of what they used to be. I mean, just speaking, like a gig that I used to go and make $1,500 on for a weekend is now $300.
Yeah,
and it's tough to make a living.
And exactly. And what's going to happen over time is you're going to end up with people doing that work who aren't nearly as capable. Or, which I think has already happened, or you're going to end up with a lot fewer people wanting to do it because they'll look at it and it's like, I didn't say, I'm not doing that. Fortunately, at the age I'm at, I don't have to go do that, and I'm grateful for that.
One of the good things that I can think of that comes from that is that it gives some of those younger pit reporters, broadcasters, that training time that you and I didn't get, that pre kind of minor league stuff before going to the major leagues, because I never had no formal on-air training. Like, nobody ever trained me to do this and say this. Like, I had advice from a bunch of people over the years, but a lot of it was watching guys like you, Chris Economaki, Dave Despain over the years, and kind of seeing, just it was watch and learn, really. It was monkey see, monkey do. And there was a lot of great advice you gave me over the years. Oh, my God, especially in those early years, because, man, I was wet behind the ears.
Well, there's truth in that for sure. I mean, you tend to learn from people that you look at and you say, oh, that's pretty good. I could do that, and I'd like to use some of that. Those are the things that help anybody who aspires to come into this and work on the air. But again, I think the problem is that given where pay rates are for the people who want to do on-air work, it's just not going to attract very capable people going forward, and it doesn't now. Because when I started hearing last year, we did several events for Flow, and I started talking to people at different tracks and hearing what some of the numbers were, because I was trying to figure it out. I was basically trying to say, okay, is this a business I want to be in? Do I want to try to move our company into this and say we can do a good job with this? I knew we could do a good job. I wasn't sure we could do it at the price point it needed to be done at. And as I looked at that more and more, I started thinking, wait a minute, this is not with the other thing. And we operate a low overhead kind of company. My office is in our home, which isn't very far from here. And as I taught you a long time ago, everybody's a contractor, including me. So there's no weekly salary overhead like a lot of businesses would have.
Right.
But still, you've got to make money doing this. Mm-hmm. And when I started looking at the numbers, thinking, okay, they're only going to pay me this much to take 3 people to this event, and it's 200 miles away, and we've got to pay per diems and mileage and all that. And then I started thinking, this just it doesn't make any sense to do that. So when there are people whose passion, and you've run into this a lot of times, I'm sure, as have I, there are people who work, I'll put work in quotes, in motorsports media, again, I'll put that in quotes, who I'll see when I go to Indy next week, who don't really treat it as a business and don't really make a full-time living at it. They do it because they're very passionate about the sport. Everybody who's been in racing for any length of time, you know that your local short track doesn't operate without a large number of people who are happy to be there, be part of it, and make $50 a night selling tickets or working the scales or whatever it might be in the infield or outside. And that's how short tracks have to cobble it together a lot of times, and I get that. And
they're mom and pop businesses.
They're mom and pop businesses, exactly. Yeah. But the level that I was able to get to and that you've been at, where you're doing this for a full-time living, you're trying to do this professionally, you're working on a national stage, you ought to be able to make a decent living doing this. And today, a decent living is, $75,000 to $100,000 a year. That's not a lot in today's economy.
Nope.
But when you work extremely hard, like I know you always have, I've always tried to, and most people who do this, who have done this, that you and I have been around over the years, now to say, oh, no, sorry, that's not available anymore. If you want to do this, you're going to make $25,000 or $30,000 a year. There's some people in the world who would be thrilled with that, and that's fine. But at some point, I think you have to look at it and say, I'm sorry, this is a business. This just doesn't make sense anymore,
And in the end, you have to think about what is best for me and best for my home life, my living, paying my bills, all the stuff like that.
Sure.
On that same level, though, back in the days, what are some of the things that you do miss? Like those production meetings, the big trucks and the crews and the guys that you remember?
Yeah.
Because there was a lot of that. I mean, I remember going to the track with you seeing 20, 30, 40 people on the crew.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, for me, the fun of this was twofold. First, being at the racetrack, being around the race cars, having raced a little myself, having us have race cars, I know like your family did, and just the pleasure you get out of putting a car together, loading it on the trailer, taking it to the track, and seeing how you measure up every week. And even when I was doing radio and then television and racing, I wasn't doing that. I wasn't running a car in the race, but I would always think about, as a racer, how would you do this? What did they do? How did this team approach it? How did this driver do? Did they make the right moves? Did they do the right thing? Boy, that was really stupid. I would never have done it that way if it was me. Mm-hmm. And you learn, and I've always been fascinated by the technology in the sport, by the technical advances in the sport, by I think one mistake we've made as a sport is looking at that industry, which is our industry too, is the move towards spec racing. It had to be done for cost control reasons. But, when I was a kid and we were racing at Danbury and I was racing go-karts with my dad, it was all about what could you come up with that was better than the other guy had? What could you figure out? We didn't buy a lot of stuff from speed shops back in those days. My dad welded.
There were no speed shops back then. Yeah. You made your own stuff.
Yeah. And a lot of it was figuring out, okay, if we put this bar here in this car, it's going to make this car handle a lot better at at this track we run at. I was racing go-karts. Everybody had the same tires because there was only one company that made them back. I'm talking about the 60s back then. But it was a question of, did you run a McCullough or did you run a West Bend? What kind of chassis did you have? And there was, karting today is like every kind of racing, is extremely sophisticated.
Oh, and it's gotten out of hand too.
Yeah, and I know you've raced in the mini sprint kind of world here, in recent years. I'm sure it's very much the same there. But I miss that. I think we lost something when we said, okay, everybody's on the same tire, everybody's engine has to have the same output, has the same torque profile, basically everything's electronic, so we're going to limit you in this way. Aero-wise, everybody's got to run the same bits. IndyCar is all the same chassis. NASCAR is essentially all the same chassis now. Yeah. So it keeps the racing closer. And it does make it somewhat more affordable because, racing is, the old joke, if you want to make a small fortune in racing, start with a big one. Still true. But I think that's something that has hurt the sport. I think that's limited the appeal of the sport to a lot of people. It used to be, we'd go to a new racetrack for the first time with, my dad and I would say, hey, we want to go. I mentioned Orange County before. I grew up in Connecticut, not far, like 60 miles from Orange County, but it was across state lines, which back then was a big deal. We're going to New York to race, or going to New York to watch. And I think we wanted to go see what Buzzy Rudeman and Will Cagle had. We'd never been to anything like that. So we drove in there the first time in, 1967 or whatever it was. And we bought a pit pass and we go to the infield and we're walking around looking at these cars. I'm like, my eyes are as big as pie plates. I'm like, man, these are guys I've read about in National Speed Sport News. I never thought I'd see them up close, and I saw Rags Carter. I'm like, my God, this guy's, a hero. He's unbelievable. And I'm looking at the cars thinking, yeah, we could build one of these. There's nothing that special about it. But then you see other stuff they are doing differently. You see how much they've got the engine set back, which at Danbury we couldn't do, and things like that. So, so it was interesting so that's one thing that I've always loved. And when I go to Indy, I'll love walking around the garages and looking at the different cars and just looking at the tiny differences between the Hondas and the Chevys, and the tiny differences because IndyCar has changed some of the aero rules this year. They're allowing a few more aero bits in different places to try to, again, keep the competition closer, give them a little more downforce, make it a little safer. On the TV side, I miss the people. It's all about the people. And you and I worked together for a number of years. I got to work with some great people. One of the things that I get asked about a lot of times is how many different drivers I've worked with over the years, and the list is well north of 100. Right. Different guys that for a long, long time the trend has been to have a driver as your analyst on a broadcast, either a guy that's recently retired or a guy that's still active, maybe in a different series or whatever it is.
Somebody with that experience.
Yeah. And, I in the speed days, I was the first person to do a NASCAR race on Speed Vision back in 1996. And up through the years of doing that, it started probably when the first TV race I did was the 1982 Pocono 500 on what was then called the Mislu Network, which was a syndication network, long gone. But that video is still out there, and Speed used to show it all the time. I mean, I would get calls from people all the time. Did you do a race at Pocono in 1982? This was, not that many years ago.
That's when you were called Ron Williams, right?
That's right.
Why'd you have
that was different. That was a different story. I used my real name at when I did those.
You had to have an alias
races.
for a little while.
For a while,
right?
I did. I'll tell you that story in a minute. But anyway, Pocono in 1982, I was on MRN. Been on MRN for like a year and a half. Mm-hmm. Which at the time was a great way to learn how to do this. It really was. And I'd been a radio and television broadcaster for a number of years at that point. But I got to Pocono to do the race on radio. And back then, and still they still do it this way, MRN, we had 3 turn announcers for the triangle and 2 guys in the booth and, 3 or 4 on pit road. So I get there and Mike Joy comes up to me. He was the general manager of the network at the time, and he was also he and Barney Hall were the play-by-play guys. Mm-hmm. And Mike was the one who hired me for MRN back then. And he came up to me and he said, hey, you do television, right? I said, yeah, I do TV news. And he said, yeah, I know that. He said, would you like to do this race on TV? And I said, absolutely. I mean, that was my goal all along, was to get on television doing races. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, Dave Despain can't get here. Dave at the time lived in Ohio, and he did a lot of motorcycle racing and things back then. And for some reason, he had to call and say, I can't get to Pocono. And Pocono, as you know, is a hard place to get to. Even if you fly to Scranton-Wilkes-Barre, it's still like an hour by car at least.
Right.
But somehow Dave couldn't get to Pocono for the race. And back then, MRN and the Cup Series raced on Sunday. There was no Xfinity or Truck Series, no Truck Series at all. What was then called the Busch Late Model Series,
Sportsman,
the Late Model Sportsman Series, didn't run there. So basically, we would get in there you could get there on Saturday morning, which is what I did. And we did a show for qualifying, but that was it. Anyway, I got there early in the morning. Mike makes me that offer. He said, okay, you're going to work with Dick Brooks. So Dick Brooks, I got to know real well. We did a couple of races a year for the next 4 or 5 years together on TV. And that was the start of that. Well, of course, Ned Jarrett was one of the pit reporters back then. So I had gotten to know Ned, and then I got to know Brooks, and that kind of started it. And Brooks had never done television. He was a pit reporter on radio for us, okay. So that was kind of the start of getting to work with all these different drivers that I've had the privilege of working with over the years, and all the way up to James Hinchcliffe in recent years. So, those experiences I miss a lot because those guys get to do something that I would have dearly loved to have done with my life, but I just wasn't quite good enough as a driver. So,
yeah.
There you go.
What are
the Ron Williams thing? You want me to tell you that story?
Yeah, okay, sure. Okay. Go ahead.
So this is the late '80s, and I'm doing the news now in the Quad Cities of Iowa and Illinois. I'm 6 and 10 o'clock anchor on what was then the number one station in the Quad. Still is the number one station in the Quad Cities, the NBC affiliate there, and. I read in National Speed Sport News, which is where I got a lot of information from Chris about where I could look for TV work doing racing. I was doing some racing on MRN, some radios stuff. But there was a network back then called Sports Channel America.
I remember that.
And it was a cable network, sports network. It was a poor man's ESPN. And they were doing a series of Busch Series races. NASCAR, Xfinity Series was then the Busch Grand National Series. And they were doing like 7 or 8 races a year in 1989, 1990, I think. And Chris had it in his column that they had made this deal. And there was a company here in Charlotte called Creative Sports, which then became ESPN in Charlotte.
Okay.
But it was Creative Sports Enterprises back then. They were going to produce the races. Mike Joy was going to call the races, and I can't remember who the analyst was supposed to be. Anyway, I thought, I'm going to call these guys and just see if they need a pit reporter or something like that. So I call, and I talked to a guy named Bray Carey, who ended up being very successful in the television business in later years. But Bray was one of the partners, along with Mike Wells, who was a legendary director in racing television.
Oh, yeah.
Worked with Mike many times over the years, ended his career, retired a few years ago from NBC. But Mike and I got to be close, and told him who I was, told him what I'd done, sent me a tape, sent the tape. A couple weeks go by, Mike Wells calls me and says, hey, Mike Joy can't make all these races because there were 6 or 7 of them. Could you come in and do, I think the first race we did was Lanier in Georgia. Mm-hmm. I said, sure. What does it pay? And it was like, I don't know, it was like $1,200, something like that, to go call the race. Well, I get there, and as I did the news at 10 o'clock on Friday, and I said, the Saturday night race, I'll take the first flight out. I'll get to Atlanta by like 9 o'clock in the morning. Race was at 8 o'clock at night. They were fine with it. It was a one-day show. Now, today, we would never do that. I mean, today, if we were doing television, we would always get there at least the day before.
Right.
So if there's a flight problem, you can get to the event. But back then, it was kind of low stakes. And I'm thinking, wow, how cool is this? So I get there, and Glenn Jarrett is my analyst, and Ralph Shaheen was the pit reporter.
Okay.
So I met Glenn, and I kind of knew him anyway. I knew Ned, and Glenn was still driving back then. And so we did the race, and it went pretty well, and they asked me to do a bunch of the rest of them. So I did several more on Sports Channel America, which became Prime Network, which then became Fox Sports Network, which is now Bally Sports, which has gone broke. So that's, in a nutshell, back to the earlier conversation about what's happened to the broadcasting business, that's a good case study right there. I mean, it was Sports Channel America. It became Prime Network a couple of years later.
Right.
It stayed Prime for a long time, and I did a lot of shows for Prime back in the 90s. And then Fox bought it. It became Fox Sports Net, and then they sold to Bally a couple of years ago. They actually sold to Disney, and then they sold to Bally, and here we are today. Bally Sports has gone broke. So
wasn't there a period though in there where it was
the Ron Williams thing? Forget, I didn't cover that. I got sidetracked. Sorry, the Ron Williams thing. So I'm flying to Atlanta to do this first race in 1989, and I'm thinking, my contract to do the news says I can't appear anywhere else on television. I'm thinking Sports Channel America is not carried in the market we're in the Quad Cities. Maybe I should use a different name. So I get there, And I've been thinking about this for a couple of hours. I drive to the racetrack, and I get out of the car, and I meet Mike face-to-face for the first time, Mike Wells. Jim Roller was the producer, and that started a lifelong friendship with Jim.
Oh yeah,
and he was an interesting guy back in those days. His wife Ann did graphics for the shows.
It's a rite of passage. I've said it many times to get your ass chewed out by Jim Roller.
Yeah, yelled at by Jim Roller. Yeah. So I could give it back to him as good as he could give it to me. So, but we've been friends for a long time. Anyway, I get there and I said, "There's one thing I need you to change for me." He said, "What's that?" I said, "I'm going to use an on-air name, and it's going to be Ron Williams. My middle name is Williams. So, and the R, I thought I could remember that in the middle of the broadcast. I thought I could remember to say, "Hey, Ron Williams here from Linear Raceway," and blah blah blah. So that's what I did. So on those Sports Channel America races, if you ever find one on YouTube or whatever, that's Ron. I'm Ron Williams there with Glenn.
I saw one from Orange County Speedway.
Yeah, that was later that same year. And the funny part about that was the night at Orange County. That was where I met the Burton brothers for the first time, because Jeff and Ward were racing in the Busch Series back then. Orange County, we get there, and the weather's bad. And I'm thinking, oh, this isn't going to be good, because I got to get back to the Quad Cities to do the news. Mm-hmm. And, of course, it was a Saturday night race. I'm thinking, if they rain out and run Sunday, I'm going to have trouble getting back Sunday night or Monday morning. And what am I going to do? And I'm thinking, all this is going through my head while I'm thinking about the broadcast. But we got on the air, and there was a horrendous thunderstorm after about, 40 laps, something like that, to the point where it knocked the power out of the track. Well, back then, production companies like Creative Sports didn't generally bring a generator to the racetrack. That came along later. So when the power went out, we were just done. About an hour goes by, storm clears, they start drying the track, and we've got Sports Channel America was tiny. I mean, it was, think back, this is cable TV 35 years ago. Mm-hmm. There was no backup programming, so they wanted us back on the air as soon as we could come up. So the power gets restored. Ralph Shaheen's the pit reporter. Back then, everything was cabled. There's no remote RF packs, no wireless stuff the way we have it today. Ralph's down trying to interview guys in the infield. He's got this long, probably 300-foot mic cable, and he's carrying an umbrella, and there's lightning in the area. They want Glenn Jarrett and I to go. I mean, Orange County back then, it's got a fairly nice tower now, but back then it had this tiny ramshackle wood booth, quote unquote, that we were working in. And it had a deck outside, like a lot of places did or do. And so they would go out on the deck, we'll turn the camera, we'll point the camera out on the deck, stand there with an umbrella, and welcome us back and tell everybody what's happened and where we are and that we hope to go racing again soon and all this kind of thing. So Glenn and I go out there, and then we hear thunder and lightning. And I dropped the umbrella. I said, I am not standing out here in a lightning storm holding a wired microphone, holding a metal rod sticking up in the air.
You might as well be standing in a puddle. Yeah, you might as well be standing in a puddle.
Yeah, let's go back inside. Of course, they didn't have lights in the booth. So let's go back inside, and we'll do this as voiceover. How about that? So we did that, and we got through it. Nobody died that night. But yeah, that was how Ron Williams came to be.
Oh my God, it's just amazing stories. Nowadays, though, what do you think? Is that contrast between radio and television? You've done both, and a lot of people that come out of radio are very successful in television. Adam Alexander is a very good example of that. Like, what is it that you think that helps that transition?
Well, in radio, of course, you don't have pictures to carry the story. You've got to be able to paint the picture yourself as an announcer. So when I would watch a race, and much like doing PA, you don't generally have a monitor for video coverage. It's changing with streaming. A lot of tracks have video, so a lot of guys do have a monitor to work with now. But basically back then, and I tried to pull from great PA announcers that I had listened to, like you were saying before. You learn ways to describe the action, and in radio, radio kind of abhors a silence, so you fill constantly. You're always, if there's dead air, people think that's weird, so you don't do that. And if you listen to an MRN or PRN broadcast today, there are times when they don't have, either there's not enough crowd, or where they have the crowd mics, the natural sound mics to pick up the cars and all that. It's not adequate. If you listen to them, a lot of times it sounds like they're in a room, not at a racetrack, which I think is ridiculous. I mean, the whole point of being at the racetrack is to convey the excitement of being at the racetrack. And if you can't hear the cars, doesn't make much sense to me. Right. But anyway, you learn doing radio and doing PA, I think, that you have to tell the story yourself. You don't get a lot of help doing it. Mm-hmm. And, back, again, talk about the changing eras, but I think back about the guys I worked with on radio, on MRN. It was Mike Joy, and Barney Hall, who is a legend, and Mike, whatever else you might think of him, is an incredibly good broadcaster of the sport. Eli Gold was one of the turn announcers. I went to college with Eli.
Really?
Yeah, Boston University. He only lasted a year. I have a degree. A good friend, though. And Alan Bestwick was one of the turn announcers back then, and I did the second or third turn, depending on the race. I didn't do every week. I only wanted to do 8 or 10 a year, and that's what I did for many years. And on pit road, we had Ned Jarrett, Jerry Punch, and Jim Phillips. Those were the three stalwarts, and then Winston Kelly came along.
Think
of those guys.
How many of that is a crew? Like we're talking about like 6, 7 guys right about there. Yeah, like that's unheard of now.
Yeah.
You don't have that on.
There was
pit
a
road.
time not many years ago when Mike was on Fox, Alan was on ESPN, I was doing my thing at Speed or wherever else I might have been hanging my hat at the time. Ned had retired from ESPN. Jerry was still on ESPN. Eli was doing Alabama and doing some MRN. And I thought, man, that group that I was a part of back in the early '80s, and for several years there, was comprised of, and I had the least amount of credentials of anybody there for quite a while. But man, those were like Hall of Fame guys to learn from back then, And I can remember Barney and Mike, taking me aside, and they didn't make it easy on the new kid, but they shouldn't have. I mean, they were like, "This is how we do it. If you want to be here, this is how you have to do it." And so that was a great way to go to school. And I don't know, all due respect to the people who are doing the radio calls now, I don't know that there's anybody like that to train up a young broadcaster in this. I mean, we were very careful to make sure we were using good English and handling things appropriately and learning how to tell the story without insulting anybody or insulting anybody's intelligence. And back then you had to bow a lot to NASCAR. I mean, Bill Jr. was at the racetrack every week, and if you said something he didn't like, he listened and you'd hear about it.
Right.
And I had that conversation a few times.
You got called in the NASCAR trailer?
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, more when I got on TV. When I got on race day, when I started doing race day in '95 and '96, we were when we started doing race day on TNN. Pat Patterson had launched that show in '93, I think it was, or '94, and in that era, I was my big break, I think, in television came in '92 when I got called by TBS in Atlanta to come and host what was called the Pit Communications Center at their Cup races, and they did 6 a year back then.
I remember that.
And I thought, man, this is a dream of a lifetime, because in those days, Ned. I'm sorry, let me back up. In those days, Ken Squire was the host of those telecasts. And Ken owned a production company along with a guy named Fred Reinstein called World Sports Enterprises, and our offices were up at the Speedway here in Charlotte. So Humpy Wheeler's daughter, Patty, had gone to work for them as a producer originally and then became the general manager of the company. But Kenley, God bless him, had seen my work on those Sports Channel America races and some other things I had done. I was doing some road racing on TV back then, too. The Trans Am was the series that I started doing in racing, in road racing. And they gave me the opportunity to be the Pit Communications Center host. Well, that job had been Mike Joy's and then Dave Despain's. So I followed them. And then I knew both of them from radio. So I thought, well, how cool is this? And some shows I didn't have a big part in. Some shows I had a huge part in. Ken, back then, the Coke 600 here in Charlotte was the marquee race that we did every year. We did the 2 races at Charlotte. We did Richmond. We did Pocono. There were a couple of others that we did as one-offs here and there. But basically, those 3 tracks were the tracks that we had as a regular deal for a number of years. And 6 races was great for me on television. It was not too much. It was enough to say I'm active in this. I did a few radio races. I was good. I was doing the news. Well, by '95, World Sports had been bought by TNN, then the Nashville Network, which was the other network that carried NASCAR. And they wanted to bring race day in-house. They took it away. They bought Pat Patterson out. They said, we're going to produce the show in Charlotte. We want you to come, because I was a news anchor, news producer. I'd been a news director several times in local television. They said, can you come in and set this up, build this for us, build this out, hire a staff, put it all together. I said, yeah, I can do that for you, sure. So I hired Jim Roller. He was our first producer on race day when I started in '95. And we worked out of what's, I think, still called MediaCom here in Charlotte. It's still a studio facility over off 77 in Arrowwood. And that became the Speed Channel Studios. So I ended up spending a lot of time there for 10 or 12 years. So I started doing the PCC, and occasionally I get a chance to call a race. Ken didn't like to do ARCA. And when ARCA was on the card, TBS televised it. So I did play-by-play of ARCA for several years on TBS. And it was just a lot of fun. It was my first exposure to that big production you were talking about before, where you've got multiple trucks, you've got 75 people running around, you've got catered lunch, you've got, the money is good,
right.
And you run across, you meet these people. That was, Kenny Wallace was one of our analysts back then when he was winning in the Busch Series when he didn't have a regular Cup ride. He did the shows. Neil Bonnet, before he got killed, God bless him. Neil was just a fantastic human being, great guy, became a good friend. And loved working with him, but he and Buddy Baker, that's where I met Buddy. Here. And so these are some of the names, the drivers that I've had the privilege of working with over the years. And I used to laugh because when in the Speed Vision, Speed Channel days, I was doing big shows and not so big shows. And they would call me up and say, okay, we want you to do these 10 Star Mazda races. Mm-hmm. You're going to voice them all over. We're bringing in, some driver who's going to be your analyst. Well, Johnny O'Connell. Johnny O'Connell, guy that's won everything there is to win in road racing. Johnny was a former Star Mazda champion. Johnny comes in, never done television in his life. I've got like an hour to say, okay, here's what you do. Listen to me. Yeah. When I stop, you start. That kind of thing. And that's, fortunately, you start, back then, we started those guys off doing taped shows. So if you made a mistake, or if you said something stupid, or if you talked all over each other, you could stop down, go back, clean it out, fix it, and do it. You could do it 8 times if you needed to.
Yeah.
But those are, some of those things, working with Bill Adam was a great road racer, working with Derek Daly, just some great guys.
What was one of your funnier moments that had happened live on TV? Because we know they happen. It's a live show. It's never perfect.
You mentioned the Champ Car World Series. That was, I still think of that as probably the most. I loved IndyCar racing, still do. Mm-hmm. My dad was an open wheel guy, like you and I share that passion for midgets, and my dad was active in ARDC back in the late 40s and early 50s, and drove a few times, not very much, but really worked on cars, built stuff for cars. He was a machinist, and he loved open wheel racing of all forms. So when I got that chance in 2003 on Speed Channel, they were in that transition period from Speed Channel to Fox, from Speed Vision to Speed Channel to, it was on the way to becoming FS1 and FS2. And there was a guy named Rick Miner who was kind of in charge of production over there. Yep. And I get along with him fine now, but back then he was not a fan of my work. And a lot of this comes down to, the success you have as an announcer in this business comes down to whether or not people like what you do. It's very subjective.
He was abrasive, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. Yeah. He was. Here's the conversation like this. I've done, for Speed Channel in 2001 and 2002, I've been their NASCAR reporter. I've anchored Speed News. I've done Le Mans, at Le Mans. I've done American Le Mans on NBC and Speed. I'd done Grand Am on NBC and Speed. I'd been doing what was then Hooters Pro Cup, which at the time was a big deal.
Yeah.
Stock cars. I was doing ARCA. I was doing probably 60 shows a year and just races. And then I was doing Speed News probably 10 weekends or 15 weekends a year. So I was doing a lot. So Rick Miner comes in, and now they're going to transition this thing. Fox is going to actually take control of the network in this time period going into between 2003 and 2004. In 2003, I had also done USAC. We did 30 live shows on Speed of USAC midgets, sprint cars, and Silver Crown cars. Again, cars I love, events I love, drivers I love,
right?
Everything. It's a fantastic thing to do. I was doing the dirt modifieds. I had a deal with Glenn Donnelly, who owned dirt at the time, and he said, he called me up. He knew we had raced at some of his tracks, many years before, but I kind of knew Glenn a little bit. He called out of the blue one day and he said, "Hey, you're on Speed. You're there in Charlotte. Could you get me on TV?" And I said, "Well, maybe. I don't know. What do you have in mind?" So we have a couple of meetings. I ended up being their lead announcer. The modifieds, we televised like 10 modified races a year on Speed back then. Plus, he started the World of Outlaw late models. Right. So I took that over too, and I placed them on Speed. I didn't produce the races. We didn't produce the races, but I was the lead announcer on all that stuff. I did Super Dirt Week for many years. It was huge fun for guys like us that love short track guys. Anyway,
So what was
03 ends.
Yeah.
I get called to a meeting with Rick Miner. I have done 94 shows for Speed Channel in 2003. I get over there to the building in Arrowwood. He said, "Nah, let's go down the hall. Let's go down the street to a coffee shop." So there was like a Waffle House down the street or something like that. So we go down there and we sit down and have a cup of coffee. He said, "Listen, I'm just going to be real candid with you. I don't think you got a big future here at this network." I said, "Well, what does that mean?" He said, "Well, I don't see much of a role for you here. I don't think we have room for you going forward." He said, we'll have you do a few things, but I really don't think, you're going to do nearly as much work for us, next year and beyond." I'm thinking, now what do I do? We've moved here. My kids are in school. I've been here 8 years. I've had a lot of success. I've had a lot of fun. I've made a good living doing this. And and I know I'm good at it. And you're telling me I'm not good enough to work here. And I know who else you've got doing shows. So I kind of picked myself up, dusted myself off, and left the meeting. Turned out I did continue to do shows on Speed for another 4 or 5 years, but he didn't really have anything for me going into the next season. But I started getting calls, and I did keep Hooters Cup, and I did keep a couple of other things. I did keep the Dirt deal. And in that winter time, and I kept up with a lot of these people I knew during the race day days. Our mandate was to cover everything, not just NASCAR. We covered IndyCar and drag racing, all kinds of stuff. Yeah,
loved race day. That was one of my favorite shows.
It was a career highlight
for someone like me to watch that growing up and then getting to work on that show was huge.
Yeah.
It was.
It was. When we started in '95, '96, it was like, come in here and plan this for us. And the mandate is cover whatever you think we need to cover. We trust your knowledge. Cover what you think needs to be covered. So we did off-road stuff. We did Formula One hydroplanes occasionally. We covered, the Isle of Man motorcycle race. We did all kinds of stuff because we were on year-round. We did 52 weeks a year, and I just had a tremendous amount of fun. Well, anyway, we started covering kart. It was during the time of the kart IRL split. We covered both series. TNN actually aired some IRL races back then, so we had a little bit of a foot in the game, a little skin in the game. But I knew a lot of the kart teams, kart guys. We had a lot of the great drivers who'd come and been. We'd had Alex Zanardi and Jimmy Vassar had been on the show. We had Ganassi on the show. We had Penske's guys had been on the show and all that. So I kind of knew my way around in that rank. So what had happened in 2001, Penske and Ganassi had gone to the IRL. So kart had lost its two marquee teams. By 2003, they were really hurting, and that was when they decided that owners had decided it was going to become an owners group. They were going to sell franchises, and they were going to try to make it financially going into the next couple of years, and it didn't work out. So a couple of investors came forward and bought the series. A guy named Kevin Kalkoven, who died recently, Jerry Forsyth, who's still alive, owned Forsyth Racing that Paul Tracy drove for. Notably.
I know the name.
And Paul Gentilozzi, who's still around and still active in
Trans Am racer.
Yeah, great Trans Am champion, a friend of mine. They bought kart and renamed it the Champ Car World Series, which is a name I had given it on TV. Andrew Craig, who was the president of kart, was on the show. He was a frequent guest. Of course, there was this political battle going on between kart and the IRL back then. And I called Andrew up one day and I said, "Hey, would you come be a guest on the show?" We had a live interview segment most weeks. So he said, "Sure, I'd come down to Charlotte and do that." So we had developed a relationship. He was on the show a few times. He left. But what happened was they realized they were kind of reconstituting kart as Champ Car World Series. Andrew had asked me off the air. He said, "What do you think we should call this thing?" They were called the Kart IndyCar World Series. They lost the rights to use the name IndyCar in this political battle that was going on. Yeah.
Right.
So I said, well, I've always called these things Champ Cars. I mean, back to the front engine dirt car days, that they were known as Champ Cars. Why don't you call it the Champ Car World Series? He said, "That's great. We'll do that." So that's what it was. So going into 2004, it's under new ownership. Craig is gone. They've turned the page. They've lost some tracks. They've lost some teams, but they're going to go forward. And as everything in racing, when a new series is announced or a rebrand is announced, everyone makes it sound like it's the greatest thing since the invention of the wheel. And that's what they were trying to do. Well, I'd started going to the PRI show back then because it was a great place to go and meet people and a great place to go and look for work, look for business. So I was at PRI in 2003 and I saw Paul Gentilozzi and we talked. And I said, "Look, I'd like to be your TV guy going forward." So we talk. We have a couple of meetings. We continue to talk. Their first race was going to be Long Beach in April, which traditionally is in April of the following year, of 2004. I thought I had the deal bagged, and I'm thinking, great, this is going to be 14 races. It pays really well. That's it. I've made my nut for the year. We're good. I get down to like 3 weeks before Long Beach, and I get a call saying, we just don't think we're going to be able to use you this year on this. We keep us, keep your number, keep our number. We'll keep in touch. We'll see how it goes. They had made a deal with a company called Beetlejuice Productions out of New York. And their claim to fame was that they produced a show for, I'm trying to think, it was A&E, which is still around. And it was like inside the actor's studio was the name of the show.
Oh, with James Lipton.
Yeah. They produced that show. And they somehow had gotten themselves into the mix to produce Champ Car. Now, producing a live 3-hour race at a road course, at a street course, at a non-permanent facility, and a studio show with 2 chairs and a black backdrop. Though, if you know anything about television, that couldn't be more different. That is like saying, I'm going to be a heart surgeon, and oh, by the way, I'm going to be a dog groomer over here. It's like it's that kind of thing. So they get Beetlejuice gets the deal. They start, and they hired Bob Jenkins, who was not with ESPN anymore, and who did not like road course racing and made it very plain he didn't. But I love Bob. He was a wonderful guy. To be their play-by-play guy. I'm trying to think of the other announcers involved. Tommy Kendall was involved at that time. My friend Jan Bikas was on pit road. There were a couple of other people, and I can't even remember who some of the other announcers were. Derek Daly was involved back then. And the races were going to air on... TNN had gone away by this point. It had become a network called Spike. They were going to air the races on Spike. And I thought, boy, how ironic is that? So they go to Long Beach, and I'm not there. I'm watching this from here, from Charlotte. Somebody in that group had the brilliant idea of building a booth that's outdoors and exposed at an IndyCar race where the noise factor is incredible. With 15, 18, 20 cars on the grid.
Right, 12,000 RPMs.
12,000 RPMs, turbochargers, tire noise, and Long Beach has a big crowd every year. So it's not like you're doing this in a room like we are.
Right.
So I remember, I heard the story afterward, they came on the air, people that had no idea how to do this, they come on the air, and you can't hear any of the announcers because, again, people who've done this would understand. Basically, in a live environment, you mix in to the microphone audio for the announcers, you mix in what's called natural sound from these trackside microphones. Well, their audio person had never done this before, and if you're not careful, the natural sound will kill. I mean, you and I couldn't yell loud enough to be heard over IndyCars. It's why they say the most famous words in racing aren't, are not, Mario's fallen out of the 500. It's that, it's is the most famous word in racing.
Yeah. What?
Yeah, yeah. But it was a disaster. So they somehow get through Long Beach. I get a call the following week. We're thinking of making a change. The next race is Monterey, Mexico. Would you come to Monterey and work on the air for us? I said, sure. As play-by-play, no. Bob's going to do the race. We want you on pit road. So they were kicking the tires, basically. So I'd never done pit road before. So I get to Monterey. Again, never been to Monterey, Mexico before either, which turned out to be a beautiful place and a great racetrack. But I get there as Jan Bikas, who I knew, because he had done American Le Mans with us previously on NBC. I said, Jan, you got to help me. You've been doing this for a long time. I've never been on pit road, certainly not in an IndyCar race. This is the first IndyCar race I'm ever going to work, and I'm going to do it on pit road where I've never been. So he gives me a crash course in how to do pit road in IndyCar, and we kind of work things out. Well, you could tell from the broadcast that, Bob Jenkins is a wonderful guy. He became a dear friend of mine. It's incredibly sad that he's not with us anymore. Bob, you could tell, just wasn't interested in being there. So we get through that show, and after that, I get a call saying, okay, the next race, the next race was Milwaukee on the mile. I said, can you come and be our host? We're gonna make you the host. So that was how I got to be in Milwaukee. But during those Champ Car days, the funniest thing of all was Beetlejuice Productions. Champ Car was paying Beetlejuice to do the production. And the way that works is, it's a third-party company. They give you a big check. You pay all the crew. You rent the equipment, and you do all the travel. And
That's
all
your budget.
Yeah, that's your budget. And they didn't have any infrastructure because they'd never done this before. So the travel, they had one guy in charge. He was like the production executive at each event. And his knowledge of racing was, like my knowledge of brain surgery. I mean, he'd been to a race a couple of times. That was it. They said, okay, you're the guy. You've actually been to a race. we go through the first several races of the season, and nobody's getting paid. So I've done like 3 shows now. We get to Toronto, and Gene Cottingham, bless him, who is the financial officer of Champ Car, calls me, all these big series. If you've ever been to a big event at a racetrack, chances are the series has a Featherlight trailer and truck as their office. Mm-hmm. Gene calls me into the Champ Car trailer, which is the office on site. He says, "Have you been getting paid?" I said, "No." He said, "How many races do we owe you for?" I said, 4. He said, "All right, I'll have you check before you leave here Sunday night." And he did. God bless him. He went to all the announcers and paid us up for till that point in the season. I think everything's cool. We're getting, it's good. We get through. We do Toronto. We get the rest of the season. We get to Laguna Seca at the end of the year. There's like 2 races left in the year. Laguna was the next to last race, and they finished. The Champ Car used to finish its season in Mexico City. We get to Laguna Seca, and I start hearing on Friday morning that the crew is going to refuse to work because they haven't been paid in like 3 months. And these are guys who are really good at this. Some of them still work on the IndyCar TV crew. And these are guys who are, relying on this to pay the rent, pay their kids' education bills, all kinds of things.
They're blue-collar guys.
Yeah, camera operators that back then made $500-600 a day plus travel. But for them, it's a week's work because you come in on Monday or Tuesday to lay cable and set the cameras and all that. And they need the money. I mean, those guys, those men and women who do that work, even today, they're not making 6 figures a year generally. And there's less of that work around now than there used to be. But at the time, I mean, this was a big deal at the time. So we get there, and I start hearing, and I walk up to a few of the crew guys who I knew from other shows and series I'd done, and I said, you guys going to work this weekend? They didn't uncap the cameras for the first practice. We used to stream the practices. Even, there was nothing. Streaming was nothing back then,
right.
But this is 2004. They didn't uncap the cameras. So Saturday afternoon rolls around. We didn't cover qualifying because they refused to work. They were there. The equipment was set up.
Right.
Everybody just sat on there. They came to the racetrack and wouldn't work. And they called a meeting in the dinner tent. They set up with these big mobile tents to feed everybody. And Paul Gentilozzi, God bless him, from the owners group, comes to this, and he personally guaranteed everybody's paycheck, and everybody got paid for the season on the following Monday. But that was you say, what have I seen that's funny? But that to me was dramatic, funny in a way that they'd let it get that far.
Right.
And then we came really close to not having a show from Laguna Seca that year. Because,
amazing.
It's crazy stuff.
To this day, some people ask me what are some of the strangest things that have happened to you or funny things that have happened to you on pit road. And it was early in my career where you had me hired to do the Mazda MX-5, Playboy Mazda MX-5.
Oh my gosh, yes, yeah.
Oh my God, I was on pit road. We were live on HDNet, and people ask me to this day what the funniest thing was, and that was when that swarm of bees hit pit road. Did you remember that, right?
I do.
Oh my God. All I remember is hearing, "Let's go down to Derek on pit road." And by then I'm hearing, I got stung on the ass. And I gotten stung pretty bad. It was bad, man. It sounded something like right out of a movie with the bzzz all around you. To this day, I still tell people I got stung on the ass live on television. And they're like, well, Derek's having a little trouble down there right now. And that was the way it went.
One of the weeks we were doing TBS NASCAR, and I think it was here at Charlotte. In the spring, for the 600 in May. And Ken Squire at the time, he wasn't elderly then. He was probably in his 60s then. And everybody knew that he couldn't see the cars really well. Back in those days, there was no HD TV, so your monitor was probably 12 inches, and maybe it was color if you were on a big budget show. Mm-hmm. You had to be able to see a tiny car to be able to pick out what was happening on a monitor. He was notorious for misidentifying the cars. And I'm doing the PCC. And to make it easier for Ken, because it was such a long day, I did the starting grid a lot of times, and then I would turn it over to him for the actual race call. And there would be times during those longer races where they would come to me and say, "All right, next segment is yours," and I would call the race by myself from a monitor down there so he could go to the bathroom or get a cup of coffee or whatever. Well, this particular day, I get that in my headset. Ken's going to take the segment off and go down the hall. So we come out of break, and I welcome everybody back, and they come to me on camera, and I'm Rick Benjamin. We're in the STP Pit Communications Center. We're here at Charlotte Motor Speedway. It's the Coca-Cola 600, and Bobby Labonte is your leader. We've run 75 of the 400 laps today, and here's your top 10, and let's take a look at the action. And I'd call a couple of laps while he was out, whatever. Well, he was also notorious for leaving his microphone on and going to the restroom.
Oh, no.
and we had a new audio guy, and in the mix, in my ear, I'm hearing Ken relieve himself on national television. So you can imagine how much fun that was. And I'm trying, and in my ear, I'm hearing people yell and say, "Cut Kenley's mic, for Christ's sake, cut Kenley's mic. He's taking a leak in there. Come on." You can't make this stuff up. You just can't make this stuff up. Oh, that's
great.
So that's, and the other thing, and I still, one of my favorite people in this, and you know him well, is Randy LaJoie, who I've worked with on TV a lot.
Oh, my God. He's the gift that keeps on giving, isn't he?
He is. I mentioned that first NASCAR race, the first NASCAR race that Speed Vision ever carried, 1996, we did a couple of races with only in-car cameras. NASCAR gave Speed Vision, or sold them, the rights. For a long time, Speed Vision couldn't carry NASCAR because TNN and ESPN had it. But somehow NASCAR had carved out the rights for in-car cameras. And back then, you might have had 8 or 10 in-car cameras on a race. And Randy and I did the All-Star race, which was the first race in 90. I think it was 90. It might have been 96.
Didn't they call it Track Pass or something like that?
Well, no, that was later. Track Pass came later. We did the All-Star race. Then we did the 600. And we did a couple of others that year that way. But anyway, Ken would see Randy on the racetrack, and he would confuse him with Bobby Labonte. So one or the other of them would be Texas Bobby LaJoie. There he is, Texas Bobby LaJoie. Labonte, Ken. And so whenever I see Randy now, well, if it isn't Texas Bobby LaJoie or Bobby Labonte, conversely, I say, hey, how are things, Texas Bobby? So we'd have a laugh out of that.
We've had Randy on the show, and he has been a pleasure to have on. But all the drivers you've worked with over the years, that you and I both know when you got to interview somebody, somebody's a good interview, somebody's a bad interview. Like, what do you do to get through the bad interviews? Do you have to carry it, or do you know that they're just going to be difficult? If it's, and having worked, having been privileged to work the higher level series that I've done. Well, here's an example in the Honda years. We did Honda at-track coverage for every IndyCar race, every IMSA race, every World Challenge race, and this is the 40-week-a-year thing we talked about earlier. And in those times, just a few years ago, Ryan Hunter-Reay was one of the lead drivers for Andretti Autosport. And I've known Ryan since he came into IndyCar. He was an original Champ Car driver. He started in 2004. Right.
I called his first win at Milwaukee. It was that Milwaukee race we talked about earlier.
Okay.
And so we've known each other, 20-some years. But for some reason, interviewing him was like pulling teeth. He's got opinions, he's got passion, he's got energy. He's terrible on television and an interview. Mm-hmm. And I would pre-interview him a lot of times, say, look, here's what I need to talk to you about. Let's just have a conversation. I'm not going to try to hang out. He certainly knew me well enough. I have never tried to hang anybody out to dry. I will ask a hard question, though, if it needs to be asked. When you're doing corporate work, it's different. You're trying to make the corporate entity, in this case, American Honda, look good. They're paying the bill. You're not going to say anything. One of the things I learned how to do in those years was to tell the story of. They never said make anything up. They never said you can't tell what happened if we have a bad day. What they didn't want was just to point the finger at their engineering or technology. I mean, then that's fine. In racing, you do the best you can with what you have to work for. 99 times out of 100, engines don't blow up at that level. I mean, it's very rare when you lose a part or a piece, but it does happen sometimes. Mm-hmm. And you just find a way to say that without making it sound as though somebody within the organization screwed up. But for Ryan, it's just always been difficult. He just does not enjoy doing media, and we did live shots for them at many events too. We developed the technology in its early days. The bonded cellular technology is the term, and we started using that several years ago. On a race day, we would do a live hit in the morning on their Facebook, their social media pages. I'd pick a driver, and we'd do a car walk around, or talk about the day, whatever it was. And I when it was his turn, I was like, man, this is tough. This isn't going to be good, And we would keep it short, and I would say, hey, I want to talk to you about these 4 things. Tell me about the day, keep it simple, and we'd move on quickly, and I try to put the best face on it. But if you have somebody like that is going to be difficult, I try to pre-interview them as my first piece of advice, because that way you'll know exactly what you have to work with. Some people, when you're doing live, and you've had this experience, I'm sure, you can coach them up all you want, but when you turn to them and start talking, some people just get this look in their eye like, this is the worst thing I've ever decided to do in my life, and you can't get a word out of them. And then sometimes my experience has been you have to learn how and you have to know how to tell the story you want to tell even without their help. I've had experiences where, and in news, I mean, remember I started 20 years in television news before I started doing this. Same thing. You're interviewing politicians, city leaders, business leaders, people at wrecks, at fires, whoever it might be. You'll get people who don't know how to be on television. I mean, it's not their fault.
One word answer.
One word, yeah.
Oh my God, that drives me crazy.
So you have to be able to tell the story without them. And if you get the one word answer, then you can advance the story. And today you got people doing this who are trying to learn and all that kind of thing. But it's painful sometimes to watch because a lot of people aren't equipped to do that, and that's a shame. And that's where we've lost stuff.
Yeah, you know what? It's so funny too because we've gotten to a point now where it's almost like, I'm trying to be nice when I say this too, but we don't have reporters on pit road. We have characters playing the part of reporters or influencers playing the part of reporters. In what way has the social media kind of played into an aspect of how we do our jobs now?
Well, I think there's a huge emphasis on social media content because you get a lot more hits, clicks, engagement that way than you do on television. I mean, there are influencers who have millions of followers. Well, there aren't many TV shows that have millions of viewers, especially in racing. So that produces people who think, okay, if I can say this or get Bubba Wallace to say this in an interview I'm doing, or if I can get somebody to do a TikTok with me or whatever it might be, that's going to help me more than learning how to be a better reporter on pit road. And that's where I think we've lost a lot of the ability to tell stories well. Really hard to tell a story on social media. It really is.
It is.
I mean, in 280 characters in Twitter, you can set the table for a story. You can comment on a story. But you can't really tell a story. And the beauty of this kind of format of a podcast, or when we were doing social media content for Honda, if we wanted to do a 5-minute story, we could do it. I could interview 4 people and put it in there. Now, I learned in the course of that, I think we were the first back in 2014 to shoot content at a racetrack and post it to a YouTube channel that we built for Honda. And then we went from there. We got involved in Twitter and we got involved in Instagram for them as well. And we put things on their website that people could access. What I learned was in that environment, and I think everybody who does a lot of social media today would bear this out, would agree with this, that the shorter, the better in terms of getting views.
Yeah.
If you make a 5-minute story in some television environments works great. I mean, if you're watching, Real Sports on HBO, they got 60 minutes. Those stories are 8 minutes long. People will watch that and stay engaged. Now they're highly produced. A ton of money gets spent on doing those. They're very high quality. But we tried to do quality with the budget we had to work with for sure. We made sure everything was well lit and well framed, well shot, well edited. I tried to be at my best as a broadcaster to do that stuff. But we found that once we got over a minute and a half, hardly anybody watched. So we started shortening all that stuff up for that. I think today, to your question about social media, the idea that you want to make an impact on social media and that's the only thing of value that comes out of this. I just think that's wrong. I mean, I just think that's a bad idea. I
agree with you because what we're getting now is we're not getting reporters or journalists.
Yeah.
We're getting, look at me, here I am,
yeah.
and this is what we're doing.
Yeah.
I get what you mean because doing this show is the easy part.
Yeah.
All of the social media posts, the pushes, the tagging that we have to make sure we've got right, the hashtagging. Like I try to handle as much as I can of that for this show, just this show.
Yeah.
And that is, it'll take you 35 to 45 minutes just to make sure you get all your posts right.
Yeah.
And all the wording and everything. Yeah. It's completely changed to where it used to be. It's funny too because I'm having a problem with it. What I'm having a problem with lately is watching the racing on TV because I can't help but get that little bit of resentment because I see the people on TV and it's like I should be doing that. Yeah. That should be me in that position. How do you cope with any of that? Because I'm sure that you've had that happen way more than I have.
Sure, yeah. It was common for me a few years ago. I mean, I stopped doing races regularly on television in 2018, so it's been a few years now. And it's still what I love to do most. I mean, I got into this because I wanted to go to the racetrack and call races. That was the whole thing. And, you know, part of it for me at my age, the truth of the matter is they're not going to hire me at my age. There's a lot less opportunity than there was 20, 30 years ago because there are way fewer networks. There are way fewer series now doing I mean, I think about this all the time or quite often. In my better years, from 92 to let's call it, Champ Car ended in 2008, and I was able to continue for a few more years doing pretty high level sports car stuff. So I had, 15, 18, 20 years of doing that. The landscape has changed so much. I mean, back then, there were many networks doing this. Back then, there were lots of series. I mean, the CART and the IRL had 2 TV packages. There were 2 competing series. There were 2 major drag racing series back then. The IHRA was a real thing. Sports cars had 2 series. There were, NASCAR had the same basic footprint that it has, but there was no idea that we could do streaming of these events and it could be economically viable. So everybody wanted to be on television. And there were, you worked with us on the Mazda project. We started that in 2006 and we kept that till 2012. And for all those years, Mazda was very active in motorsports marketing. Now, again, changes that come, they have changed completely. They do nothing at the major leagues. I mean, they went up to the point of providing engines all the way up to Indy Lights, and they were racing in the prototype categories in Grand Am and then in IMSA. Well, now that's all gone. All they're doing is grassroots stuff. They have the MX-5 Cup. That's the only thing in racing they have. They don't brand the engines in the Road to Indy anymore or anything.
Really?
Yeah. So
when I was working with you guys, that we had the Playboy Mazda MX-5 Cup, we had the Star Mazda series, there was all of that.
There was USF 2000, the Atlantics,
Formula 2000,
and they got to where they were putting there were Mazda engines on the Indy Lights. Those engines were branded Mazda, and that those last couple of years, we were doing all those different races every year, and so we were doing 30 shows a year just for them back. Not many. It seems like not many years ago, but it was 10 years ago we stopped doing that. So. That is a way of saying, again, I mean, there was a lot more television of racing being done at a high level back in that era from 1990 to 2015, let's say. Well, now, again, you got 1 IndyCar series, 1 drag racing series. You've got NASCAR. F1 has sucked a lot of air out of the room in this country because it's owned by an American company now. There are 3 races this year in America. You've got that Netflix series, the Drive to Survive thing, and which has gotten a lot of attention. And that's
even
one of those,
from non-racing fans.
which is great.
Which
is great for the sport, and I don't fault them for it a bit. I mean, they caught lightning in a bottle with that thing. It's good for them. I'm happy. IndyCar's trying to emulate that. NASCAR's been trying to come up with something like that for years, and they haven't been able to because when you try in broadcasting and television to take a formula and apply it again elsewhere, that's hard to do. And to look at Drive to Survive and say, well, we can do the same thing for IndyCar, or we can do the same kind of show for NASCAR. No, you can't, because it depends on the personalities. And it depends on the particular vision of that producer who looked at that and said, wait a minute, if we do this right, we've got all these rivalries, we've got all these interesting characters, we're going to all these interesting places around the world, this is going to be great visually. You can't replicate that in NASCAR and IndyCar.
I know. No, we are getting to the end of the show.
Yeah.
And I want to thank you for everything that you've done in my career. Because,
you're welcome, guys.
I tell people all the time, if it wasn't for you and guys like Joe Ligon, who gave me a shot, I mean, and it happened very similar to what happened with you. I mean, it was, an ASA race at Nashville. Pete Pistone was the pit reporter. He couldn't make it because he got appendicitis, and I got a phone call saying, can you be here? And if it wasn't for that, that started the ball rolling. And I never would have gotten that experience, had it not been for you. And then also with you there tutoring me at the track too. It's an education you can't buy. So I appreciate that. And for me, it's surreal to have you here because here I am talking to you when I watched you for so many years on television.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it, Derek. And it was a lot of fun. We got to do some cool things together. I had forgotten about that. Gosh, we did the ASA Late Model Series.
Yep, the Southeast
which doesn't
Asphalt
exist,
Tour.
and then the Southeast Asphalt Tour,
Yep,
and
we did
then Mazda.
Some Star Mazda, the Playboy MX-5 Cup. That was, to this day, some of the most fun I've ever had because First off, the women were beautiful. They were gorgeous. How do you go wrong with having Playboy playmates at the racetrack? The people were cool. They were just so inviting, and they were a great group. And
and those guys, those two Mazda executives who we got that deal through back then. Jim Jordan was their director of motorsports marketing.
Great
and
guy.
John Doonan was the head of the motorsports program on the competition side. Well, John is now the president of IMSA, so I see him quite often. And Jim is now a high executive with World Challenge, with what's now called SRO World Challenge, because it's gone through different ownership. But yeah, to your point, I mean, you meet some wonderful people along the way in this. And for me, the exciting thing about going back to Indy with Able Motorsports the next couple of weeks is, they're gonna check a mark off their box. I mean, it's a situation where the Ables they have a very successful business which funds their racing, which is great for them. That's how a lot of people do it. Bill has wanted to be an IndyCar entrant for a long time. He got this put together with R.C. Enerson and his dad, who have a car. Ables are going to run the car out of their shop and use their team to do it. And if they make the show, I'll get to stand on the grid one more time and be an entrant, basically, for 2 weeks in the Indy 500. So how cool is that? I mean, a month ago, I wouldn't have said, I said, what? I'm not going to Indy ever again. That's not going to happen. But I get to go and see there and be part of it, be part of it. See a lot of people I know and have a lot of regard for, and it's cool. It's a small, I tell people all the time, and to be a part of broadcasting and racing, you're part of two of the world's biggest small families. I mean, really.
Yeah, it's a big sport, but a small fraternity.
Yeah. And it's just cool. It's a lot of fun, and I still get excited going to the racetrack, and I hope I get to do that for many more years. So.
Well, being that you don't live that far from this studio, we got to have you back again. Okay,
you're
Rick,
on.
Thank you very much.
Derek,
Thank you for everything you've done for me.
Happy to do it.
Rick Benjamin, the legend, joins us on the Derek Pernesiglio Show. We want to thank all of you for joining us, and as always, we'll see you the next time. Bye.